I never thought my life would fall apart in a single evening. But it did. I still remember sitting at the dinner table, staring across at my wife, no, my ex-wife, as she placed her hand over another man's. A man who wasn't me. A man dressed in a custom-tailored suit, with $1 million smile, while I sat there in the same worn shirt I had worn a dozen times before. That was the night she told me. The kids deserve better. They'll have a real father now, she said, her voice sharp, almost rehearsed, as if she had been practicing the line for weeks. She looked at me not with pity, not with sadness, but with a cold detachment that pierced me deeper than any knife could. Her words echoed in my skull. A real father now. What was I then? A ghost? A placeholder? A man she tolerated until someone richer, shinier, more powerful came along? I wanted to scream, to slam the table, to remind her of every sacrifice I had made. The long nights working 2 jobs, the weekends I gave up to spend time with the kids, the countless times I said no to myself so she and the children could have more. But I couldn't speak. My throat locked. My chest tightened. And I just sat there silent. She looked at me like I was already dead to her. And maybe in that moment I was. The days that followed blurred together. I moved out quietly. Not because she asked me to, but because I couldn't bear the sight of the house without her in it. Every corner whispered memories of us. Our first night moving in, the time we painted the kids' room together. The night we fought so badly I slept on the couch but woke up to her arms around me anyway. All gone. Wiped clean. Replaced by her millionaire husband's name on the mailbox. I crashed at a friend's place for a few nights. Tried to drink the pain away, but even alcohol betrayed me. It made me remember more. Her laugh. The smell of her hair on my pillow. The way she used to touch my hand under the dinner table when we were younger, before money, before greed, before the world told her she could do better. But nothing broke me more than the kids. The first time I went to see them after she remarried, my son clung to my waist and asked, "Daddy, why don't you live with us anymore?" I froze. I couldn't answer. My daughter, younger and more innocent, smiled and said, "It's okay, Daddy. Mommy says we have 2 dads now. 2 dads. One rich, one poor. And in their little minds, one worth more than the other." That night, I went back to my childhood home. My parents had long since moved out of the old family house, but it was still there, empty like a relic of the past. I didn't know why I went. Maybe because I had nowhere else to go. Maybe because I wanted to feel like a child again. Just for a moment, when life wasn't so complicated, when betrayal wasn't part of my vocabulary. The house smelled of dust and forgotten years. I walked through the living room where the wallpaper was peeling, and into my old bedroom. My childhood posters still hung on the walls, faded and curling at the edges. My old desk sat in the corner, scratched and cluttered, as if I had left it just yesterday. I sank onto the bed, burying my face in the pillow, inhaling the musty scent of time. And for the first time in years I cried. Not the kind of crying you can hide, not the quiet sobs in the shower. No, this was guttural, raw years of sacrifice and humiliation pouring out of me. I thought I had nothing left. No wife, no kids, no home, no dignity. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with me yet. It happened on the 3rd night. I couldn't sleep. I paced the creaky floors of the old house, restless, drowning in memories. Something pulled me toward the attic. I don't know why. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was desperation, maybe it was the house itself whispering to me. The attic ladder groaned as I pulled it down. Dust rained over me, coating my hair and shoulders. With a flashlight in hand, I climbed up into the darkness. Boxes, old trunks, broken furniture. It was exactly how I remembered it, the place where forgotten things went to die. But then I saw it. A case. A briefcase. Black leather weathered with age, tucked behind a stack of old photo albums. My light caught the glint of something on its surface. I pulled it out, coughing as dust clouded the air. That's when I noticed the engraving. My name, etched into the metal plate on the front. I froze. My skin prickled. My name. Not my father's. Not my grandfather's. Not anyone else's. Mine. My hands trembled as I brushed the dust off. The lock stared back at me, cold and unyielding. I rattled it, but it wouldn't budge. Questions flooded my mind. Why was this here? Why did it have my name on it? Who had left it behind? And then the most haunting thought of all. What was inside? That was the moment my life began to change. But I didn't know it yet. At that time I was still just a broken man, sitting in a dusty attic, clutching a locked briefcase with no idea that inside it lay not just my salvation, but the weapon that would turn betrayal into vengeance. I stared at that briefcase for hours. It sat on the attic floor like a silent beast, daring me to open it. Every time I touched it, a shiver ran through me. My name engraved on the surface, not scribbled on a sticky note, not tagged with tape, but carved into the very metal as if it had been made for me. But how? Why? And why had I never seen it before? I pulled and tugged at the lock, but it didn't give. It was old, sturdy, the kind of lock you'd need a key for. My first instinct was frustration, the same kind of frustration that had been bubbling inside me for months, years even. I almost threw it against the wall, ready to give up. But then I remembered something. My grandfather. He had always been a man of secrets. Quiet, sharp-eyed, always watching. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't warm either. The kind of man you respected, not because he demanded it, but because he carried an invisible weight and authority you couldn't question. And he had a habit. Strange one. He believed everything important should be hidden in plain sight. I ran my fingers along the briefcase again. The engraving of my name wasn't random. It was intentional. He wanted me to find this. But why now? Why after he was gone? I searched the attic frantically, pulling open old drawers, shaking boxes. And then under a loose floorboard near the far corner I found it. A small brass key tarnished with age. My pulse hammered in my ears. With shaking hands I fitted into the lock. Turned with a soft click. I opened the briefcase. At first glance it didn't look like much. Stacks of old papers, envelopes, yellowing documents. But then buried beneath them I saw the embossed seal. A thick envelope, unopened, marked with my grandfather's insignia. The same one that used to hang on the wall of his office. I tore it open, my breath ragged. Inside was a document that made my vision blur. A will. Not just any will. My grandfather's will. I scanned the lines, my hands trembling, my eyes darting across the words. I leave the sum total of my estate, including controlling shares of the company, to my grandson. Narrator's name. The room spun. I read it again. And again. The words didn't change. My grandfather had left me everything. The company. The estate. The fortune. $100 million. And yet I had never been told. For 20 years my family had kept this hidden. 20 years they let me scrape by, begging for scraps, working like a mule while they lived comfortably, while my wife mocked me for not being enough. They knew. They all knew. The betrayal hit me harder than my wife's words, harder than losing my kids. Because this wasn't just about money. This was about identity. About worth. About blood. They had stolen not just my inheritance, they had stolen my life. I fell back against the attic wall, clutching the will to my chest, my tears hot and bitter. My grandfather had trusted me, chosen me, believed in me, and my family had buried it. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something stronger than despair. I felt rage. Pure. Boiling. Righteous rage. That was the night I swore I would take it back. Not just the fortune. Not just the company. But my name. My dignity. My place in this world. And when I did, every single person who had betrayed me, my family, my ex-wife, her millionaire husband, would learn what it meant to underestimate the man they thought was nothing. Because I wasn't nothing. I was the heir. Soon, I would be their reckoning. The will shook in my hands like it carried electricity. My mind reeled, tumbling between disbelief and fury. $100 million. A company my grandfather built from nothing. All of it mine. And yet, for 2 decades, I had lived like a beggar in my own bloodline. I stayed in that attic until the sun began to rise, the gray morning light leaking through the small window, casting stripes across the papers scattered around me. My throat was dry, my body exhausted, but my mind was a storm. One question screamed louder than the rest. Who hid this from me? It wasn't an accident. It wasn't some forgotten box. Someone had deliberately locked this briefcase away. And whoever it was, they had stolen not just my inheritance but 20 years of my life. I started piecing it together. My parents. They had been the first ones with access. After my grandfather's death, they handled everything. Or at least that's what I had been told. I was too young at the time, still trying to figure out my place in the world, still trusting them blindly. I remembered my father's words. There wasn't much left for us, son. The company went to the board. The estate was sold off to pay debts. We'll be fine, but you need to work hard now. I believed him. I worked 2 jobs. I sacrificed. I built my life on that lie. My mother, too, had been strangely distant whenever I asked about Grandpa's estate. She would change the subject, distract me, smile tightly and say, "Those things don't matter. Focus on your future." But now I saw the truth. They hadn't wanted me to focus on my future. They wanted me to stay blind to my past. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If the will named me the sole heir, then my parents would have had nothing. Unless they kept it hidden. Unless they convinced the rest of the family it never existed. Unless they decided my future wasn't worth as much as their comfort. My stomach twisted. My own parents. The 2 people who had sworn to protect me, guide me, love me. They had stolen from me. They had betrayed me. I stumbled out of the attic with the briefcase clutched in my arms. My legs felt weak, but I didn't stop until I reached the kitchen table. I spread the documents out like puzzle pieces, scanning them over and over, looking for something, anything that would tell me how deep this betrayal went. That's when I found it. A second letter. Folded, yellowed, tucked between legal documents. It was addressed not to me, but to my father. With shaking fingers, I opened it. If you are reading this, then you know the truth. The company belongs to my grandson. Not you. Not your wife. Him. He is the only one I trust to carry our name forward. Do not stand in his way. If you do, the blood on your hands will never wash clean. I dropped the letter. My breath caught in my throat. My grandfather had known. He had known my father might try to steal what wasn't his. He had warned him. And yet, my father had done it anyway. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, rage coursing through my veins. All those years I wondered why my parents treated me differently. Why my father never looked at me the way other fathers looked at their sons. Why there was always this unspoken distance, a wall I could never climb. Now I knew. Every smile, every word of advice, every "we love you, son." All of it had been laced with lies. They weren't protecting me. They were protecting themselves. And in doing so, they had chained me to a life of suffering. The sound of my phone buzzing snapped me back to reality. It was my ex-wife. For a moment I considered ignoring it. But something inside me twisted. A cruel kind of curiosity. Picked up. Her voice was as sharp as ever. "You need to stop calling the kids so much. They're adjusting to their new life. You're confusing them." New life. Confusing them. I almost laughed. The irony was unbearable. Here she was parading around as if she had upgraded her life. As if I was the burden holding her back. Meanwhile, she had no idea that the man she thought was nothing was sitting on $100 million secret. I didn't tell her. Not yet. But in that moment I swore to myself. She would know. They would all know. My parents. My ex-wife. Her millionaire husband. Every single person who had spat on me, lied to me, betrayed me. They thought they had buried me. But all they had done was plant a seed. And now it was time to grow. I didn't sleep that night. The will lay on the table, the ink burned into my mind. My grandfather's voice seemed to echo through the words. He is the only one I trust to carry our name forward. I had lived 40 years believing I was a failure. A man too small to give his wife and kids the life they deserved. And all that time, the truth was locked away in a briefcase with my name on it. No more. The time for being silent, broken, invisible was over. The first step was to confirm it. It wasn't enough to read the will. I needed proof. Documents. Legal weight. If my family had hidden this from me, they had surely tried to bury the paper trail. I spent the next week chasing down records. I went to courthouses, archives, lawyers' offices. Every time I mentioned my grandfather's name, heads turned. He wasn't just some man. He had been a titan. His company had once been the backbone of entire industries. His wealth stretched beyond imagination. And everywhere I went I found fragments, copies of shares, titles of properties, legal memos, and all of them pointed to one truth. My grandfather had left everything to me. But someone, my father, my mother, maybe even others, had worked tirelessly to erase me from the story. Until now. The second step was silence. Revenge isn't loud in the beginning. It's quiet. It waits. It gathers strength in the shadows until the moment comes to strike. So I didn't tell anyone. Not my ex-wife. Not my children. Not even my closest friend. I smiled when my ex-wife called to gloat about her new life. I nodded when my parents asked how I was holding up, pretending to be the same broken man they thought they had crushed. Let them believe I was nothing. Let them laugh. Because soon their laughter would turn to fear. And then came the third step, leverage. The company. My grandfather's company still stood. Though it had changed hands, passed into the grip of men who valued profit over legacy. But the shares, my shares, gave me power. Quietly, I began reaching out to old associates of my grandfather, men who had respected him, men who remembered me as a boy trailing behind his shadow. Some were surprised. Some were skeptical. But all of them listened when I showed them the documents. And slowly a new narrative began to form. Not of a broken man abandoned by his wife. Not of a son betrayed by his parents. But of the rightful heir. The man destined to take back what was his. It was during one of these meetings that I felt it for the first time. Power. Not the cheap kind that comes from money alone, but the kind that comes from truth. From justice. From the knowledge that every step forward was a step toward making those who wronged me pay. And oh, they would pay. One evening as I sat in a dimly lit cafe, papers spread before me, I caught my reflection in the window. I barely recognized the man staring back. Gone was the hollow-eyed shell left behind by betrayal. In his place sat a man with purpose, with fire in his chest, with something dangerous in his eyes. It hit me then, my ex-wife, her millionaire husband, my parents, they still saw me as the same broken figure. They didn't know what was coming. That ignorance was my weapon, and I would use it to tear their worlds apart. The reckoning had begun. And this time I would not stop until every last one of them knew the cost of betraying me. When you finally hold the truth in your hands, there's a strange moment of silence. Like the world is waiting to see what you'll do with it. For me, that silence lasted a day. I woke up with the will under my pillow, stared at it over coffee, and felt the weight of everything I had been denied. The rage was still there, yes, but beneath it now sat a quieter thing. Clarity. I knew what I had to do. Not in a checklist or a speech, but in the slow, stubborn way of a man who has been shoved off the stage for too long and is finally coming back. My first call was to a lawyer. He was not the flashy kind you see on television. No loud suits, no bravado. He was a lean man with a reputation for cutting through smoke. When I pushed the briefcase and the will across his desk, he didn't smile. He didn't speculate. He simply read, folded his hands and said, "We'll proceed with probate. We'll subpoena records. We'll put this in front of a judge. But understand, legal truth is one thing. Social truth is another. People can erase you on paper, but getting them to face it will be a different battle." That was the part one wanted most, forcing them to face it. I wanted them to look me in the eye and feel the weight of what they'd done. We filed papers quietly at first. The law can be a slow animal. It moves with gravity and process. But there are ways to quicken its steps. My lawyer found a thread. A chain of memos from the executor of the estate. Signatures that didn't add up. Bank transfers that led to accounts with my parents' names attached. Someone somewhere had manufactured a plausible narrative to hide the will. It was ugly and it was deliberate. Armed with a legal team and the cold certainty of paper, I began my confrontations, first, the easiest because it was the smallest stage, my ex-wife. I found her at a charity luncheon a week later. She had the kind of polish that said money had taught her how to move, a laugh that had been engineered to charm, a polite hand that felt the price of 1,000 dinners. Her new husband lingered behind her like a bodyguard in an expensive suit. I walked up as if I were an old acquaintance passing through. Her smile was automatic. "You look rested," she said, the kind of compliment meant to undercut rather than to uplift. I looked at her for a long beat. I could have said so many things. I could have shouted the truth, thrown the will into the fountain, put on the kind of scene that people would remember for weeks. But that's not who I was anymore. The man who lost his children's laughter to a casual explanation had been stripped down and rebuilt. My revenge would not be noise. It would be consequence. Instead, I said quietly, "Do you remember when you said the kids would have a real father?" Her smile stiffened. "This isn't the time." "It is the time," I interrupted, softer than she probably expected. "Because you should know I'm not the man you left in the gutter. I have something you and your new life don't even suspect." She laughed, a brittle sound. "Is this about money now? You always made everything about money." "No," I said. "It's about truth. And the truth is in my hands." That was enough. The rest played out in legal motions and in the newsroom. My lawyer did his work and the press did theirs. Once that first article hit, the one that called the Storie heir unseen, everything accelerated. People I hadn't spoken to in years called me. Distant cousins, old men who had worked for my grandfather, a retired executive who had kept a nervous eye on the company even as it shifted hands. The narrative shifted under my feet. Where there had been pity and dismissal, there was suddenly curiosity. Where there had been silence, there was conversation. My parents reacted the way guilty people react when the floodlights come on. My mother called me in the middle of the night, her voice thin with practiced shock. "Where did you find that?" she asked. Not "how are you?" Not "why didn't anyone tell you?" But "where did you find that?" My father's reply when I confronted him, calm, careful, practiced, was the kind of thing you hear at the end of a long play. "We thought the board had handled it. Your grandfather had enemies. We did what we had to do to keep the family afloat." Their words had the color of rationalization. In their barest honesty, they admitted to decisions made out of fear of losing a house, fear of poverty. But fear is not an excuse for theft. Everything I had been denied was rationalized away in private commutes and grocery lists. That casual theft of a life I'd been promised had been dressed up as survival. When we served notice to the company, a politely worded demand for production of shareholder records, the executives panicked. They had built empires on the assumption that the heir would be a ghost forever. Some of them had groomed the company into the kind of machine that feeds on small compromises. Money changes hands quietly in boardrooms where few eyes watch. My arrival made those quiet hands tremble. The first public reckoning took place at a board meeting. I remember the fluorescent lights, the glossy table, the way the suits looked like they were waiting for someone to make a joke. I didn't make a joke. I laid the will on the table, let the heir go out of the room. A man who had signed his name on a document meant to make that will vanish tried to explain himself. He mispronounced legal terms and his voice shook. Someone leaked emails to a reporter. Emails showing transfers, evasive statements, half-baked explanations about debts that had been paid with company funds. The story spread like a stain. My parents showed up with a lawyer of their own, eyes wet with the performance of regret. They apologized publicly in the family group chat first, then in letters. "We tried to protect you," they typed, as if 3 sentences could build a bridge over 20 years. But the court does not react to apology. It reacts to evidence. I had the will. I had the ledger entries. I had signatures. When the judge read the documents in open court, it was not my voice that broke the silence. It was the paper. The signature of my grandfather, the date stamped, the legal memo advising the executor to secure the will. A paper trail that did not lie. There are 2 kinds of people who crumble first in situations like this. The ones who are guilty and have always known, and the ones who built their lives around thin excuses. My father, who could command a room with a glance, became a man who could not meet my eyes. My mother, whose smooth politeness had always been her shield, began to stumble over simple sentences. They tried for a while to spin the story into a tragedy about misunderstanding. But you cannot spin around a signed will. The more the legal world closed in, the more their private world unraveled. Friends stopped answering calls. The house we all grew up in, where laughter once echoed, suddenly felt small like a dressing room after the curtain falls. Neighbors looked at them differently. They had to sell a car to cover legal fees. My father's name was quietly removed from boards and dinners. People take pleasure in the public fall, but the private weight was worse. There are few things more corrosive than living inside your own disgrace. And then there was my ex-wife. Her public position softened into a private desperation. She called me less like a jibe and more like a beg. At first she asked for money, then for access to the children, then for mediation. She thought leverage would still be leverage. She had built a life on the assumption that I had nothing. When that assumption began to crumble, she found herself bargaining in a vocabulary she had never used. Humility. There is a measure of cruelty to revenge that I will not deny. I felt a private satisfaction in watching the people who had pushed me aside stumble. But even in that satisfaction there was an ache. I had not planned to ruin lives. I had planned to prove something to myself, that I could stand up. That I could reassemble the name that had been used as a currency and stolen. In every conversation with the press I was careful. I did not gloat. I did not use the word revenge. I spoke of justice, of paperwork, of truth. The difference mattered, not because it softened the blow for them, but because it kept me human. My grandfather's name was bound up with more than money. It was bound up with factories that had fed towns, with employees who had pensions dependent on the company, with men and women who had trusted his handshake. I could not undo the past with vengeance alone. I had to steer it so that whatever power I reclaimed would not be consumed by vindictiveness. That's why, even as the lawsuits moved forward and the press followed every twist, I also began doing something else. I talked to people who had worked for my grandfather and had been pushed out by the new regime. Men with grease under their fingernails, secretaries who remembered the exact cadence of my grandfather's keys, executives who had been asked to sacrifice quality for profit. They gave me context. They gave me loyalty, not because of my name but because they had respected the man who had built what they had. It became clear that rescuing the company, not just taking its money, would be the true act of reclamation. I did not want to be the man who emptied a vault and abandoned a legacy. I wanted to be the man who honored it. The board voted to invite me in as a steward, under oversight, while the auditors finished their work. Many wanted to stonewall. Many wanted to drag the process into years of litigation. But courts have their rhythms and reputations matter. Investors, practical, profit-minded men, smelled risk in the turmoil and began to set conditions that favored a clean transition. Transparency, credentialed oversight, and a plan to restore confidence. My parents watched as a stranger, their son, rose in stature before their eyes. Perhaps the cruelest part of it was the way their friends left, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The town that once admired them now measured them with sober eyes. One late night, after the board meeting where the auditors recommended removing certain officers for misconduct, my father came to see me. He was a broken man in a cheap hotel across town, the same man who once lectured with an iron voice. He sat across from me and said, "We did what we thought was best." I looked at him for a long time. There is a kind of intimacy to seeing the person who raised you stripped bare by evidence. My forgiveness was not immediate. I did not offer it like a bandage. Instead, I let him see the full range of my hurt. I told him in a soft voice that might have been pity, "You took my life. You taught me to build nothing and bow to what others decided for me. I have to decide what to do with that life now." He asked, half pleading, half hopeful, "Will you take us back?" "No," I said. "You took that from me." Those words landed like a final note. It was not gloating. It was not cruelty. It was a closure I had been denied for decades. The media loved the family drama. They loved the image of the son rising from the ashes to reclaim a throne. But the quiet part, the hardest part, was reconciling that ascent with the loss of what might have been. My children remained distant. They were still young. The lawyers argued custody battles and I did not want to drag them further into the spectacle. There were things I could take back, money, shares, the board seat, and there were things I could not. The tenderness of a bedtime story, the small domestic mercies that are not for sale. In the end, the truth did its work. The company was placed under my stewardship, with conditions to restore trust. The men who had used my grandfather's name as a veneer for greed were removed. The finances were straightened out, and employees who had been bullied into exits were offered reinstatement or fair severance. I did not turn the place into a mausoleum of punishment. I set about repairing what had been damaged, and in doing so I found a strange, slow peace. For those who had betrayed me, my parents included, the consequences were heavy. They had to answer questions in court. Some payments were traced and restitution was demanded. They lost face, friends, and the quiet comforts they had hoarded. My ex-wife's new husband, who had once sneered at my worn shirts, found his invitations thinning. His investors asked awkward questions about the sources of funds used in that lavish wedding. The world had a strange appetite for its own justice. When people ask me if it felt like revenge, I tell them the truth. There was satisfaction, yes. But it was married to sorrow. Reclaiming what was mine meant watching the people I had once loved shrink away under the light. It meant admitting that some things like trust and time can never be fully recovered. There is a final image I keep when I think back. My grandfather's signature on that will, firm and decisive. The man I had thought distant had chosen me. That choice was more powerful than any theft, because it meant that even in their betrayal, there had been someone who believed in me. My work in the company, restoring factories, rehiring old hands, publishing transparent ledgers, felt like a way of honoring that quiet faith. And when I passed by the mirror now, the man staring back at me was not the one who had been left at the table. He was someone who had walked through ruin and come out on the other side. He had taken his inheritance not to humiliate the people who had hurt him, but to restore a legacy and to show, in the most practical terms, what had been stolen. I did not parade my victory. I built it. I let consequence and truth do the rest. The day the court confirmed the will, everything shifted. My parents lost the power they had hoarded for 20 years. Their reputation crumbled. Their friends vanished, and for the first time they had nothing to say. My ex-wife, too, realized the man she'd mocked as a failure now stood taller than the millionaire she'd chosen over me. But I didn't scream. I didn't gloat. I simply walked past them, briefcase in hand, as silence filled the room. Because real revenge isn't about proving them wrong in words. It's about becoming everything they tried to keep from you. And as I stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of betrayal finally lifted. I wasn't the broken man they abandoned. I was the heir, the rightful one, the man who survived their lies. And I would make sure my children knew, the truth always wins.